Okay, it is 11 o'clock, so I will get started. So, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Community Mental Health Drug and Alcohol Research Network's webinar, Bridging the Gap, Bringing Evidence to Life in Practice and Policy. My name's Katie Sam, and I am the project coordinator for ComBarn. So today I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the lands of which we're all meeting today. Today I'm lucky enough to be working on the lands of the Gadigal and Wongal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to any First Nations people that we have attending today. I'd also like to recognise people with lived and living experience of mental health and substance use needs and their important role in leading policy and service reform, particularly through research and evaluation. So thank you so much for joining us today. I hope that everyone is able to take something away from the session, and I'm very, very optimistic that you will. So today we're going to be exploring the principles and strategies for bridging the gap between research and practice and bringing your evidence to life with our fabulous presenters, Kate Davies and Kerryn Butler. Kate is the Research Director at the Law and Justice Foundation of New South Wales and is passionate about the power of rigorous and robust research to shape more socially just and equitable systems. She holds a PhD in sociology, Master of Public Policy and Management, and a graduate certificate in alcohol and other drugs. Her research has explored topics related to homelessness, mental health, disability, child protection, and youth justice, using a range of mixed participatory and creative methods. Kate has worked throughout the Asia Pacific region in research, evaluation, and community development roles, and is a conjunct senior lecturer at the University of Newcastle. Kerryn Butler is a principal researcher at the Law and Justice Foundation of New South Wales, specialising in service and program evaluation, and holds a PhD which examined hepatitis C testing and treatment among people who inject drugs. She has led a number of large-scale projects, including a statewide evaluation of the Drug and Alcohol Consultation Liaison Services in New South Wales and the development of its model of care. Her clinical research activities include 2 world-first clinical trials for opioid agonist treatment, and she is the author of a chapter in the National Guidelines for the Treatment of Alcohol Problems. Prior to moving into research, she worked in frontline drug and alcohol services in a range of settings, including hospital, residential rehab, and outreach programs. So before I hand over the reins to our wonderful and highly impressive presenters, I encourage you all to please use the chat and Q&A functions throughout the session. Kate and Kerryn are more than happy to answer all of your burning questions and have this session to be interactive as possible. So please don't be shy. We're due to finish at 12 o'clock today, and the webinar is being recorded for you to be able to share with your networks at a later date. That's all the housekeeping done. So thank you so much, Kate and Kerryn, for bringing your expertise to ComDan today.
Thanks so much, Katie. I'm just checking that everyone can hear me and see my slides.
Yeah, you just might need to switch the setting, Kate. It's just in your presentation mode.
Oh, this was the fear that we talked about, wasn't it? Despite our best efforts in testing. Just give me a little moment. Can you see it without my notes now?
Perfect, Kate. Thank you.
Oh, lovely. Kerryn and Katie and I did discuss yesterday the pitfalls of showing what can be embarrassingly basic notes to an audience if you have the wrong presenter view in place. Um, it's a real pleasure for us to be here today. Kerryn and I are both people who are really passionate about bringing research and evidence to life. We might not run through introductions to ourselves because I think Katie has covered that really nicely. Thank you for the really warm introduction, Katie. I've been involved with ComDan for a number of years, being part of the Research Ethics Committee. So really happy to join you in this forum. Kerryn and I both come from practitioner backgrounds as well. A lot of my work has been in mental health space, in policy and practice, and now doing that in research. So, hopefully we are among our people today. So the plan for this session is not for us to kind of give you detailed training about evidence-based practice or to tell you how to suck eggs, really, about this kind of work. We want this to be a session that's meaningful to you and your particular area of practice. So think about the ideas we talk about and the approaches that we discuss in the context of your work. And I know for some of you that might be face-to-face practice, some of you that might be management, policy, and indeed if you are a researcher joining us today, perhaps you can think about how the work that you do generates evidence that can support practitioners and policymakers in really identifying and accessing and applying the kind of evidence that we generate. So this is intended to be an introduction to some key concepts and their application to community health and human services practice environments. We might not introduce anything revolutionary and earth-shattering, but hopefully what we can provide here is some space really to think about critically reflective practice. And a lot of what I present in this next session about evidence and evidence-based practice and policy making may be familiar to you. I'll use the term evidence-based practice, but when I say that, I mean evidence-based practice and policy making. So policymakers, I'm not forgetting you in these discussions. So this isn't intended to be a training or a teaching. Really, the purpose is to create space for critical practice and to think about what it means to be an evidence-based practitioner in the real world and in imperfect settings where you don't necessarily have access to the time, resources, capacity building to apply some kind of textbook version of evidence-based practice. And yet, if you're here today, you are certainly demonstrating a strong commitment to doing the best that you can for the people who you support. So let's get into it. You might want to jot your own notes as we talk through some discussion points. You might want to put some points in the chat. That would be wonderful if there were some comments in the chat. It certainly helps me see where your thinking is at. But, I will give you moments throughout this first session to kind of pause for a bit of thought and think about what these questions mean in your context. So I'm opening with a question, and my question to you is why we need evidence-based policy and practice. Like, why is this important? I'll give you a few moments to jot notes, think about it, and perhaps add something to the chat if you want to share. So we certainly don't need evidence-based practice because researchers like me think that research is really important, and we desperately want an audience for our hard work. Evidence-based practice is essentially about doing better by the people that we support. It's a mechanism for accountability, for building trust in our work, for safe practice, for transparency, and for better outcomes. And that's for the people who we directly support, in your case, in mental health and drug and alcohol services and support mechanisms. It's also part of accountability around the efficient use of limited resources. We have a responsibility to do the best we can with the very limited resources that we have to work in with these spaces. It's also part of how we as individual practitioners maintain our own standards and among our kind of communities of practice as practitioners. Bradley has made the wonderful point that it's about representing the needs of community. And yeah, absolutely. I think there is, as we'll discuss in a moment, space in evidence-based practice for that kind of community upwards approach to evidence as well. And Madison has commented that if we've got the power to put in place policies and practices, then we've got a responsibility to ensure those best interests, absolutely. Yeah, and it also supports advocacy and funding. Wonderful. I feel like I'm among friends with those comments. So it is important. And there's a lot of rhetoric around concepts like evidence-based practice, but behind that is something really meaningful for us and the community and the people we support. So if we think about evidence-based practice, and we'll talk about it as a process in a moment, what counts as evidence? And this is surprisingly, unsurprisingly, I'm not sure, a bit of a controversial question in some respects, and much debated about what actually counts as evidence. And I come from a social science background, and it's certainly been a highly contested discussion about what counts as evidence and what is meant by scientific evidence, for example. So again, I'm going to give you a moment to pause, think about it, post anything in the chat that you would like to, and then we'll think about what this question means. Here are some of my thoughts about what counts as evidence. And these are reflections that come from the literature, the body of work about evidence-based practice, but also some reflections from being a practitioner, a policymaker, and someone who has been a strong advocate around lived experience and models like peer work throughout my career. So some of these forms might be types of evidence that you're already using in your practice, and you might want to think about why you use some more than others. We'll look at some of the models that are proposed in the literature and where some of this comes from in a moment. But a key point to take away is that all evidence must be considered critically. So some forms of evidence are likely more robust and credible than others. And that can be because of the methods that are used or who produced the research. But I don't actually think there's anything such as purely objective evidence. So the methods might be robust, but who decided on the research question? What questions do and don't get asked in evidence? So my point here is not to deter you from using evidence, but to be a critical evidence-based practitioner. So looking at some of these examples, Kerryn's going to talk more about evaluation as evidence in a moment. But, we're asking critical questions all the time about who funded an evaluation, for example, who took part and who didn't take part in evaluation. an interesting question I've been contemplating in a recent evaluation project where a key government department wasn't able to participate because of internal policy. What does that mean to the evaluation outcomes? Service data is really important, as Kerryn will discuss, but how reliable is that data? It's only as good as our consistency and reliability in recording it. Lived experience, I think, is a really critical part of the evidence base, but whose voices are being heard, whose voices are missing, are the right questions being asked, and academic research, something that's close to my heart as a former academic and certainly a current researcher. We pride ourselves on producing reliable, credible evidence, but I've been on the other side of receiving evidence to inform my practice and policy making, and have certainly felt that disjoint in how research is done and presented, and it can sometimes feel impenetrable and irrelevant, and that's a really valid position to take. And I think as researchers, we've got an obligation to break down some of those barriers. You may have seen this or a version of this hierarchy of evidence. So this came from evidence-based medicine, which was kind of a starting point for the kind of movement of evidence-based practice. And this is a pretty structured way of thinking about evidence. This hierarchy evolved from David Sackett's work on evidence-based medicine, which emerged in the kind of late 1990s. The version that I have used here, I have particularly chosen because it includes expert opinion, including the opinions of practitioners and consumers. I recognise the problematics of language here, but we'll save that for another day. Thinking about your own practice, again, this might be something that you just want to reflect on and take your own notes about and come back to at a later point in your practice. It's one thing to recognise the importance and validity of tools like systematic reviews or meta-analyses, and they are methods where the broad body of literature is examined and the themes or findings from across that body of literature is brought together. So that's kind of collating the best available evidence with a particular research question in mind. And it is a fabulous method. I absolutely stand by the importance of meta-analyses and systematic reviews. In the hierarchy of evidence, this is described particularly in relation to randomized controlled trials, as the gold standard is how that often gets described. But randomized controlled trials are really tricky things, right? And if we think about the nuance and complexity of many of the spaces in which you work, there are all sorts of practical, ethical, resource restrictions to whether the kind of interventions and practices that we're working on might actually be appropriate for a randomized controlled trial. And what does that mean in terms of demonstrating the legitimacy and impact of the work that we do? These are tricky questions, hence the need to look at this critically. Another really important critique of something like the hierarchy of evidence, and indeed all of the kind of constructions of what counts as evidence and whose knowledge counts are the kind of voices that get missed out. And in Australia, certainly we need to be particularly mindful of the colonisation of knowledge and the extent to which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives and voices and research leadership are missing in a lot of the knowledge bases. This is kind of a description of the gold standard textbook world of evidence. A model of evidence-based practice that aligns with approaches of co-design that's come out of my research over a number of years is this model that draws together and recognises the importance of robust research evidence, but also the kind of wisdom that comes from practice, and of course the wisdom and knowledge that comes from lived experience. So I propose that there's this sweet spot where those kind of knowledge intersect and are used in meaningful ways to inform practice and policy making. So that's kind of, I guess, where I have arrived at in my kind of critical thinking about evidence-based practice and policy making over the years. And I think that there is space for all of those forms of evidence and knowledge. So this, if I could put this slogan on a t-shirt, I would. Evidence-based practice is a process. We are not talking about a particular practice or intervention or treatment. We're talking about a practice as a way of working. So evidence-based practice is iterative and it's contextualized. It's not about taking one intervention and applying that in a blanket way across different contexts. It's about how we work in critical, thoughtful, informed, and accountable ways. Because the work that you're all doing is really complex. So, evidence-based practice is not a set of practices, but being able to review the evidence on a particular practice is important. So when you're working through this process of evidence-based practice, you might be looking at a range of interventions and the evidence that relates to those. Ideally, evidence-based practice is a beautiful circular process, but hey, in reality, whose work and whose life works like that. So, more likely we're kind of bouncing around parts of that process. Some of this can seem so obvious, right? And yet we see that there are some evidence-based practices and interventions and treatments that persist. And, I feel like I'm constantly banging my head against a wall in some respects about how some of these interventions manage to continue within a kind of evidence-based practice process. So one of the classic examples that people like me often refer to is around the justice space, and particularly youth justice. And it has been one area of policy, legislation, and practice, indeed, where we have seen practices continue that are specifically non-evidence-based, and it's perhaps an opportunity to reflect on that, because this is one of the barriers to practicing in evidence-based ways. Why is it that some practices persist? I want you to have a look at, the red, blue, green, and yellow text there are a range of headlines taken from the media. One of them's not. Can you identify out of those four headlines which one is not a real headline? Take a moment to think about it. If anyone's bold enough to share in the chat, please do so. Is it the red, blue, green, or orange? Yes, of course, Madison. It is the green. Indeed, like an easy question, right? Never have we seen, and perhaps never will we, but I like to be more positive than that, a headline such as, the New South Wales government increases funding for multisystemic therapy for young people. And I have used that example specifically because there is a really strong evidence base around multisystemic therapy. But that's complex stuff, right? Those are the kind of interventions that are slow and complex and nuanced, don't make for sexy headlines. In the last Queensland election, the image in the top right-hand corner there, adult crime, adult time, sign the petition, was a key part of the Liberal National Party's policy platform in that election. Frighteningly so, yeah. And a very clear example of that. In case we imagine this as a new area of debate, has been debates around the extent to which youth justice interventions are not evidence-based practice has been going on for years. You can see a headline on the left-hand side there: Queensland drops expensive failure of boot camps for young people. That's from about 2014, 2015 evaluation. And yet here we are in the most recent election with the Queensland government reintroducing those sorts of camps. So my point is, we work in imperfect settings, right? So it's one thing for me as a researcher to bang on about the virtues of evidence-based practice, but you are working in politicized environments, environments where you may not get to exert the level of control that you'd hope for over your practice. So in the next few slides, we're going to kind of unpack what that means and what you can do and think about what you can control. So when we think about evidence-based practice kind of conceptually and as a model, indulge my research side for a moment. We can think about evidence-based practice at that kind of macro high level, about policy, and think about some of that Queensland government policy around youth justice, for example. That's the high level stuff that will frame the work that we do. Unless you're in some of those decision-making roles, and I hope some of you are, or at least on your way towards those kind of roles, that can be really difficult to influence. But, that's where our resources come for particular programs or roles or work. That meso level is where we see that kind of organisational influence. So if you're in a senior management role, for example, that might be where you're able to influence evidence-based practice, organisational wide ways of working. But at a micro level, we can think about evidence-based practice in terms of what we do as individual practitioners or policymakers, and the decisions we make about how we do our work, how we engage with people, and the kind of mindset we take into our work. So that's what we're going to talk about in this kind of final part of the evidence-based practice section. So despite the imperfections of the contexts in which we work, we can be evidence-based practitioners and policymakers, and at the very least kind of apply a mindset and incorporate this into our ways of working. And I suspect that all of you joining today probably, are already practicing well within this kind of mindset. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't join a session like this. But these are really valuable principles, I think, to reflect on individually, but to think about in terms of our teams and the people that we work with. Being an evidence-based practitioner is about having that questioning, curious approach to our work, being critical, sourcing evidence, but also critically evaluating it. Asking those questions about whose knowledge counts here, whose knowledge is being discounted, that capacity to integrate evidence and really think about context, and to be reflective. And it is a process. So we are not thinking here about a one-off opportunity, but a way of working that's ongoing and iterative. So how do you kind of do this? How do you apply that mindset in a day-to-day world? These are steps that are drawn from the literature. There are many kind of examples and variations on these steps described in various literature. I think these 5 are pretty helpful. So starts by having a clear question. What is it you want to understand or you want to find out? Tracking down the best available evidence, and there's a level of pragmatism involved there, and Kerryn will talk a bit more about not letting perfection kind of be a barrier to practicing in these ways, critically appraising the evidence, integrating your professional wisdom, and having kind of confidence and trust in your own wisdom as well, and potentially the practitioners who you trust and respect around you, and always connecting the evidence back to the person who you are working with, their values, circumstances, and preferences, and then evaluating that cycle and starting again, because this is a way of working. So in the last kind of moments, you might want to think, and it's probably helpful now or later. I'm assuming you'll get copies of these slides. I'm certainly happy to share them. And it, um, this is not necessarily a great example, but bear with me. We'll think about what this might look like in practice. I'm a practitioner working in a community mental health setting, for example, and the burning question for me is, where are the men going? I feel like none of the men that I'm supporting are making it to the end of the program. Yeah, this is the practice question that's bothering me. I want to understand this and be able to better support the people in this program. So I might develop a question like, what makes men more likely to stay engaged in community mental health programs? The more specific that question, the better often. And then you track down the best available reports, journal articles, systematic reviews are wonderful if you can get your hands on a relevant systematic review, because that brings together a bunch of evidence. Service records, use what you've got. Draw on professionals, experts who you trust, ex-client surveys and demographic and profile data that might help you contextualize. Then critically appraise the evidence that you've been able to draw on. Is it credible? Was it peer-reviewed? Beware dodgy journals and reports. There are increasingly journals that, and they unfortunately are often the ones that are, or some of those that are publicly open and not behind paywalls, but they don't necessarily have strong peer review processes. So think about the credibility of the sources and what knowledge was included or excluded, and then really work through that process of contextualizing that in your practice and in relation to the people that you support. And back you go and start again. This is a rag bag of some kind of free resources. I certainly recognise that a lot of journal articles in particular are often have a fee for accessing them, but be creative about where you can access some of the good quality freely available evidence. And evaluation and using what you've got internally is a really important part of generating that evidence base, and some golden opportunities there. On which note, I'll hand over to Kerryn.
Thanks, Kate. Right, can everybody see my screen okay?
Perfect, Kerryn.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Okay, so we've talked about evidence, thanks Kate, and we've talked about practice, but how do these two worlds connect in a meaningful way, especially in the community sector where things are fast moving and resources are often tight and complexity is often high? This model helps us answer that question. So it's based on the idea that evidence-based practice and practice-based evidence aren't in conflict. They're actually part of the same cycle. So feeding into and strengthening each other. So let me just run through those different parts. It starts on the top left, which is efficacy research. And that's the kind of research you see in controlled trials. The question here is, does it work under ideal conditions? For example, a therapeutic model tested with a very specific client group in a structured setting, often with exclusions to keep things clean and measurable. That kind of research is important. It gives us the confidence that an intervention can work, but it doesn't tell us whether it will work in our communities with the people we actually serve. So next comes effectiveness research, and this takes those interventions and tests them in real world settings. It starts asking, does this still work when the clients are more diverse or the settings are less controlled and the complexity ramps up? And this is a shift from research into practice, and it's essential for translating knowledge. But even here, the knowledge is still often flowing one way, from research into service. And that's why practice research is so powerful. This is where evaluation sits. And we're not just applying knowledge now, we're generating it. Evaluation asks, what are we learning here and now from what we're doing? So it might be a small outcome evaluation using client feedback, might be a process evaluation of how a peer-led group is run, but it's embedded in your work. It reflects your clients, your team, your community. And if it's done well, with some integrity and clarity, that evaluation is evidence. It becomes part of that bigger picture. Then we have service systems research, and this is where those local evaluations, those insights from practice start to build to scale. So we might analyse outcomes across multiple services, or we might use administrative data to track patterns or gaps. It's still grounded in practice, but it starts to speak to funders, policymakers, to whole sectors. Next round of formal research looks like. So most of us are not running clinical trials or undertaking academic research. You're delivering the services, often in dynamic environments, and that's where evaluation comes in, especially practice-based evaluation. So the key takeaway here is evaluation is not the poor cousin of research. It's a vital part of the evidence cycle. And in community mental health services and drug and alcohol services, it's often the starting point of meaningful evidence. But here's the caution. If evaluation isn't done with enough rigour, if it's too vague or too anecdotal or methodologically weak, it doesn't just get ignored, it can actively mislead. So our job is to build evaluation practice that's both rigorous and relevant. That helps us learn, helps us adapt, helps us contribute to the bigger knowledge ecosystem. So this cycle reminds us you're not just using evidence, you're helping to create it. So why evaluate? This is the question that underpins the entire exercise. And the answer depends a little bit on your role. But for most of us in community sectors, there are some shared reasons. First and foremost, we evaluate to improve what we do. Evaluation helps us understand what's working, what isn't, and why. It gives us a clearer picture of how we're affecting the people that we're here to serve. Another reason is we learn from delivery, not just from design. So most programs don't unfold exactly the way they were planned. And evaluation lets us learn from what actually happens on the ground. That's particularly important in complex real-world settings. Another reason, if you want to grow a program or secure further funding or adapt something for a new setting, you need more than just good intentions. So you need some credible evidence. And evaluation provides the backbone for those conversations, for building a case for scaling, funding, or adapting. Another reason might be to foster an organisational learning culture. So evaluation builds internal capability, it normalises reflection and learning, and it helps teams to get curious about what's happening and creates a structure for improving practice over time. There's also an accountability piece. So evaluation gives us a way to show what we've done and what it achieved. It helps funders, partners, and communities to see the value of the work. And finally, a well-designed evaluation can help shift systems, especially when it elevates practice-based insights. It gives voice to lived experience and local knowledge in a way that can inform policy and reform. So these are the reasons, most of the reasons we evaluate, but here's the tension. Evaluation only serves these purposes if it's done well. If it's rushed, vague, or methodologically weak, it can lead us in the wrong direction. And that's why getting the basics right matters, even in small-scale practice-led evaluation. So hopefully now we know why we want to evaluate. This slide gives a quick overview of common types of evaluation. You don't need to use all of these in every project. The key is to choose the type that suits your purpose. So the first one I've got here is a process evaluation, and this looks at implementation. What actually happened? Who took part? How the program was run? What barriers or adaptations came up along the way? An example of this might be in a peer-led recovery group. This might look at how the sessions were facilitated or whether referral pathways worked, or if certain client groups weren't participating as expected. It doesn't tell you if the program worked, but it helps explain what was delivered and why things played out the way that they did. Next is the outcome evaluation. And this type of evaluation focuses on what difference the program made. Usually that's for the clients, but it can also include staff outcomes or changes in how the services are delivered. So let's say we're evaluating a program that supports people after release from custody. We might track changes in housing stability, engagement with services, or self-reported wellbeing over that first 6 months post-release. These outcomes are meaningful, but in a complex service environment, they're also influenced by a range of other factors: housing access, parole conditions, family supports, or other programs. These may all shape what happens after someone leaves custody as well. So even if we see improvement, we can't assume the program alone caused that change. What we have here is evidence that the program contributed to those outcomes, not that it caused them directly. And that's okay. In many community settings, contribution is the most appropriate and honest claim. The important thing is to be transparent about what the data shows and where its limits are. The outcomes that we choose should still be meaningful to participants and stakeholders, clearly linked to the program's purpose, and measurable using reliable tools or indicators. So outcome evaluation gives us a structured way to assess short-term or immediate results, and it helps services reflect, adjust, and advocate for what they do. Impact evaluations go a step further. So here we're not just tracking change, we're trying to understand whether the program caused the change and whether the outcomes lasted over time. To answer those questions, we need a really robust evaluation design, something like a comparison or control group or a time series analysis. We need validated outcome measures, not just a measure that we're making up. And we need strategy for follow-up over time. So this is where evidence-based outcome indicators become essential. Outcomes should be clearly linked to your program logic, if your program has one, meaningful to stakeholders, and where possible, drawn from existing validated tools. Using really well-established measures helps ensure that your findings are not just credible, but they're comparable as well. And here it might be important to note that an impact evaluation often needs to build on an earlier effectiveness finding. So before you can assess long-term outcomes, you need to know that the program worked in the short term. So impact evaluation. Finally, on that one, this kind of evaluation does take time and resources and support. It's not something to rush into, but when it's done really well, it provides really powerful evidence for funders and policymakers and the communities that we serve. The last type I've got here isn't actually a separate type of evaluation, but a way of doing it. Participatory evaluation involves clients, peer workers, community members, everybody in deciding what's being evaluated and how. So an example of this might be a service working with First Nations clients, co-designing the evaluation approach with community members to ensure that it's not just culturally safe, but that it's meaningful, that we're actually measuring the things that matter to them. Participatory evaluation doesn't mean compromising rigor. It just raises the bar for relevance and trust and legitimacy. So the main thing to be clear about is what you want to learn. Whether it's about delivery or outcomes or impact or adaptation, the right kind of evaluation helps you ask better questions and find more useful answers. So we've just looked at different types of formal evaluation, the structured, planned approaches that help us test, measure, and reflect. But evaluation isn't just doing a project or a report. It's a way of thinking, an approach to our everyday work that's curious and reflective and intentional. When we approach our work with an evaluative mindset, we're not just delivering programs. We're observing, we're asking questions, we're noticing patterns, and we're using what we see to make things better. That means we can start doing evaluation, even informally, by just taking some small steps, noticing what's happening, gathering simple data, asking, what are we learning? What's changing? What do we need to understand better? So on this slide, we've got some examples of small but meaningful evaluative exercises, ways to start turning activity into evidence. One of the strengths of practice-based evidence is that it draws from the work that you are already doing. You don't need a whole new data system. You need to look at your work with an evaluative lens. So it's about recognising the raw materials for evaluation that already exist in your practice. So some examples might be client feedback, whether that's structured or informal. That helps us understand what's valued and where there might be friction. Session notes and observations can reveal adaptations, unspoken barriers, or things that worked unexpectedly. Referral and attendance patterns might show drop-off points or disparities in who's accessing your service. And staff reflections, well, they're a vital but underused source of insight into how a program operates. When we start treating these as evidence sources, not just admin or documentation, they can form the backbone of small-scale, practice-led evaluation. The challenge again is just rigor. Anecdotes and admin data only become evidence when we ask good questions and we just stay curious to what the data is really telling you. So this is the invitation. Look at what you already have. The evidence or the data for the evidence might already be there. You just need to elevate it through method and reflection. So now that we've talked about how to bring an evaluative mindset into our everyday work, this slide offers some practical first steps. These aren't formal evaluations. They're just ways to begin noticing, testing, and learning in a structured but achievable way. So if you're wondering where to begin, this slide is for you. Evaluation doesn't have to be perfect or complicated to be useful, but it does have to be thoughtful. So start with a meaningful question, very similar to Kate with when you're looking for evidence. Start with that meaningful question, something your team actually wants to know, not just what the funder is asking for. That can be very important in other contexts, but in your practice, what do you need to know? This could be something like, why are some clients leaving after a couple of sessions? Or what do people value most about a peer support group? And then use what you've already got. Look at your feedback forms, your notes, even debrief discussions. You might be surprised what insight is already there. And then document your process. Write down what you're trying to learn, how you're gathering information, what you're seeing. This step is often skipped, but it's really what turns reflection into evaluation. If you feel stuck, partner where needed. This could mean reaching out to Comdan, working with academic partner, or just getting a fresh set of eyes on your draft tools. And then finally, really, really importantly, share what you learn. Evaluation only adds value if it gets used. So it might be an internal summary or a team presentation or a brief report to funders. But the point is, use your learning. In practice-based evidence models, small evaluations done well are not second rate. They're how the cycle begins. Just start and stay curious. So as we start taking those small steps and embedding evaluation into our practice, it's also helpful to be aware of some common traps. And this is not to discourage us, it's just to help us do the work with a little bit more confidence and a little bit more clarity. So this slide pulls together some of the most common traps we see when people start doing evaluation in community settings. And again, the point isn't to criticise, but let's build awareness and avoid wasting our effort, I suppose. The first one is unclear or overly broad questions. It's really common to hear questions like, what's the impact of our program? But unless we unpack that, like impact for what, for whom, in what time frame, it's just too vague to evaluate properly. So we need really sharp, specific learning questions to get meaningful answers. The next one is sampling without strategy. Often we just talk to the people who show up or who finish the program, but that misses people who dropped out or that didn't even engage in the first place, and that will skew what we learn. Even if we can't do random sampling, we should still ask, who are we hearing from and who are we missing? The next one is using outcomes that aren't evidence-based. So sometimes people create brand new outcome measures or use success indicators that aren't really tied to any accepted framework. And that makes it hard to know whether change has actually happened or how to compare your results. So where possible, use existing tools or build on known models. The next one is confusing activity with impact. This one's, it's subtle, but it's really important. So we often report how many sessions we ran or how many people were referred, but that tells us what we did, not what changed. So you can run 30 sessions and still not shift outcomes. So always try and pair your activity data with something about what difference it made. And then the last one is over relying on anecdote. Personal stories can be powerful, and I'm absolutely not saying we should stop using them, but we do need to be cautious. If we're only highlighting the best case scenarios or the most emotional ones, we risk giving a bit of a distorted picture. So the goal is to use stories and systematic data, not one instead of the other. So none of these are deal breakers. They're just often the places that we trip up. And with a little bit of planning and support, they're all fixable. So just remember, evaluation doesn't have to be academic, but it does have to be intentional. This slide may interest some of you or may not, I wasn't quite sure, but we often hear if people are looking to go further than just tracking outcomes and actually test where your program is causing change, you are then stepping into effectiveness evaluation territory. Now, this isn't necessarily doing a full-scale academic study, but it is borrowing some of the methods from effectiveness research. Things like comparison groups, valid outcome tools, rigorous design. Effectiveness research is typically done in academic settings, but community organisations can apply some of the same principles to build more robust evidence of what works in the real world. It is more resource intensive and definitely not something to start without support. But if you're ready, and especially if you're scaling up a program or seeking new investment, it can be incredibly powerful. So most importantly, get support early, whether that's an academic partner, help from ComDan, an evaluation expert. The design makes or breaks this kind of evaluation. So I've just got a couple of bullet points there. Be clear on your purpose. Effectiveness is attribution. So you need to be able to compare it to somebody that is a comparable group that did not receive what it is you're testing for. Engage in research or evaluation, choose or adapt valid, reliable outcome measures. Remember, you need to follow up as well as baseline, consider your sample sizes and recruitment strategy. ComDown has some ethical oversight that you can lend from as well. And allow time and resources. It does take more time and more planning and more money. But if you want robust, credible evidence that really stands up to scrutiny, it is worth it. And just remember, you don't have to do it alone. Reach out. Building a partnership can really make all the difference. So where to from here? So we've covered a lot today. I hope it wasn't too much. We've covered from evaluation types to rigor and how evidence is built from practice. But this final slide is just a chance to pause and reflect. So what's one thing that you can take back to your own program or service? Doesn't have to be big. Maybe it's starting with a better feedback form, or refining your outcomes, or planning a small evaluation with a clear question. Because evaluation isn't something that sits outside of your work. It's something that amplifies it when it's done well. So you don't have to do it alone. Reach out, stay curious, and just start where you are. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you so much, Kate and Kerryn. What a fabulous presentation. I got so much out of it, and I'm sure everyone else did as well. We are running short on time for questions. So what I might do is I'll ask attendees if they've got any questions, please either email Comdan or email. Kate has kindly put the research at the Law Foundation email there, and they are more than happy to answer your questions. But what I particularly loved was really actionable steps of how to get started and where you might run into some troubles as well. And it was incredibly targeted to the community sector as well. And I also loved that it was really framed around kind of curiosity, leading from curious questions that arise from services as well. So, look, I will thank everyone for attending today, and a very special thank you to Kate Davies and Kerryn Butler. And this webinar will be recorded and will be available shortly on the ComDone website. And a short survey will pop up as you're leaving, and I highly encourage you to fill it out to know if we hit the nail on the head or if we've got some improvements. Angela, yes, the slides will be made available, and they're incredibly helpful resources for you to take back into your day-to-day work. So I look forward to hearing from all of you, and thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Thanks, Kate and Kerryn. Have a lovely day.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you.
us.
Thanks, everyone.